Hello and welcome again to TelecomTV. My name is Martin Warwick. We're here in Dusseldorf in Germany at the SDN and OpenFlow World Congress, and I'm talking with Andy Randall from Metaswitch. Andrew, welcome, good to see you.
Good to see you, Martin.
To begin at the beginning, as they say, what is Gulfstream and what's it for?
So Gulfstream is a project that we initiated about 18 months ago, really at the early days of SDN, looking at how do we take traditional control planes and implement them in an SDN environment such that you can take OpenFlow enabled and SDN enabled switching equipment that has no innate intelligence and make it look to the rest of the network like a traditional network component. So essentially the applications are all about offloading the functionality of traditional routers and putting them onto low-cost commodity switching hardware. I'm
going to sling in another question here that you may or may not be expecting, but given the emphasis that has been on routing, as you say, even as an Englishman living in the States, I still have to say router. Given the fact that routers have had such a predominant position in networking over the past N years, do you think that NFV and SDN is going to have a major impact on the routing industry and on routing products?
I do actually, yeah. I think I think long term there's a picture that that we believe in, which is that you have the intelligence of the network moves out of dedicated devices into software elements, and that applies to routing just as much as it does to all of the other use cases that we're talking about. Now, routers are particularly complex beasts, and that transformation is going to take time. But the long-term picture is pretty clear. You have commodity hardware, that's commodity compute, commodity storage, and commodity networking, and the intelligence is all in the software layer.
Good answer. Thank you very much for that. Tell us about Metaswitch's background in SDN then. I know the company well, as you know, and I know you've been in it for quite some time. So tell us about that background and why Metaswitch's approach is different to others.
Yeah, so I think one thing to understand about Metaswitch as a company is that we've always been a software company. We've been in networking for many years, and we've been in networking software for many years. Historically, that's our ability to get that technology into the market has always been through the OEM route. So OEM customers, the major router manufacturers, would license our technology, embed that in their networking equipment, and bring it to market. So we've got a very established business and a lot of internal expertise in MPLS and IP and layer 2 control planes. So when we started to see what was happening with SDN, it made sense for us to say, well, we have all this expertise in networking software. Now there actually is a way to bring software to market independent of hardware. That's fundamentally what SDN is about, is breaking apart that hardware and the software components. So the fact that we have decades of technology and experience really puts us in a very different position from, I think, a lot of startups that are coming at it from a very different perspective. So it allows us to take a much more evolutionary approach from some of the traditional control plane world to the more open SDN world.
As we mentioned earlier on in the interview, we're here in Dusseldorf in Germany, the SDN and OpenFlow World Congress. What SDN applications in particular are you talking about at this show?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the overall theme is router offload. So we're not trying to replace all the functions of traditional routers, but what we're saying is, are there particular applications in the network where we can offload some aspects of the traffic? And there's a couple in particular that we're talking about and indeed showing on our booth at the show. The first one, and the demonstration here is in partnership with Broadcom, something we call BGP lean switch. And this is at the edge of data centers. Traditionally, you've had quite high-powered border routers. So we're not talking about the top of rack type of switch where a lot of SDN has been applied to date. We're talking about the very edge of the data center where you have links into multiple carriers, you have links back into the traditional data center network. And what we've done there is we've offloaded the processing of BGP protocol and the internal topology functions and put those onto a controller and allow you to use a low-cost switching device at the edge of the network, which typically the kind of products that you might use for top of rack, but now you can use those as your edge border router into the data center. And we're working with some fairly large global content delivery network and data center operators to trial and deploy that. So that's the first application, BGP lean switch. Second application we call intelligent aggregation, and in fact at the show here we're demonstrating that in combination with ADVA. And the idea here is on the carrier side of the network, in the aggregation layer, traditionally you have aggregation is a layer 2 function. So all traffic from the customer edge into the network goes through these devices, but all traffic comes back to typically the provider edge router. That is where the IP processing takes place. It's where the knowledge of IP routing happens. So what we said was, well, if you could put some of that IP intelligence into the aggregation layer, you can actually short circuit some of that traffic. And the reason this is interesting is because a lot of the traffic now going through carrier networks doesn't actually go all the way out to the backbone. A lot of it stays local because you have locally cached CDN content. So a lot of video streaming, which in some of our customers' cases we've talked to about this application, they said, yes, 65% plus of our traffic could be applied to this kind of application. It stays within the local domain and therefore can be offloaded from the router.
That's a high percentage.
I don't think that's the case in every scenario, but certainly there are customers who have done the analysis and said that's the amount of traffic they could offload from the traditional provider edge routers.
Thank you. Interesting stuff. Final one then, Andrew. Project Calico, open source effort. What is it? How's it going? There's a huge emphasis, as we're both well aware, on open source as far as NFV in particular is concerned, but SDN as well. But what is Project Calico?
Yeah, so the genesis of Project Calico is, as you know, as a company we provide a number of virtual network functions, so virtual IMS, virtual SBC, application servers, these kind of things. So we had a lot of experience putting applications into an NFV environment. And one of the things we realized as we started particularly playing with OpenStack and those kind of environments was that the networking layers had all sorts of issues with them. Very complex to provision, troublesome to scale, just a lot of issues with open source networking. And there are some proprietary plugins that you can use from various vendors, but those have some of the same issues as well. And a lot of the challenge comes with the fact that you're implementing overlay networks and adding layers of complexity where actually you want to be removing them. So what we said was, well, we want to scale data centers in the same way that we've scaled the internet backbone. That's what makes sense, because that's how we've built scalable networks in the past. So we put a virtual router essentially within each server within the data center, and then make each workload, each virtual machine, an addressable IP endpoint, and flatten the network so that we can use the same kind of scaling techniques that we've used in the internet and apply them into the data center. And when we took this idea out to some of the very large kind of over-the-top Web 2.0 kind of companies that have built their own infrastructures, they said, yep, that's exactly how we've scaled up. But it's not been how the carriers have been assuming that they're going to build and scale networks. So we said, how can we drive adoption of this idea? And we thought it was absolutely right for open source. We're hearing a lot at the show here about how carriers want things to be in open source, and it seemed like the right kind of platform to be getting the idea out there, to be putting it into open source.
As the first phase of NFV comes to an end and we move from the sort of informative to the normative, what do you see as the next big challenge?
Yeah, I think the key thing that we're seeing is it's all around orchestration. It's all around how do you stitch these pieces together. Most vendors, and us included, have focused very much on how do you put services from a physical device into a software device, and how do you architect them. Now, as multiple vendors are doing that, you're now seeing the challenge of, well, how do I now stitch those services together to create an overall experience for the customer and a manageable network for the operator.
I was just going to make the point, it requires sort of managed interoperability.
Absolutely.
How close is the industry to that, do you think?
I think we're getting there on some pieces of that. So we certainly, I think the orchestration, the players who are working in orchestration are working very well to define templates for how you turn up services in the way that they're currently being defined. But I think the longer term direction that we're seeing is that those services become a lot more granular. So instead of having a virtual CPE instance, you break down a CPE into a lot of different smaller discrete elements, and you use something called service function chaining to tie them together. And that is still, the standards for that are still evolving, and therefore, the orchestration layer above those standards is we're still, probably a couple of years away from having that finalized.
What do you think of the show and the event here? This is the third year. Darmstadt, Bad Homburg last year, Dusseldorf this year. Each one's been great in its own way, but I mean, it's just mushrooming now, isn't it?
It's quite incredible, and I think I think going back to Darmstadt, the launching of NFV at this show was really the signature event in the industry of several years, and so people are realizing that this is the place where everyone comes, and that just has it's the network effect in both senses, right?
Absolutely, it really is. I think it's a really great place to come.
So I'm amazed how many faces I'm seeing in the corridors that I just am seeing at other shows, but it's like everyone is here.
It is fascinating times. Andrew Randall, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Martin.